We are in a series called The Road to Recovery, and I just want to remember with you that this road to recovery, the word recovery, applies to both Jesus and us because he recovered from death through resurrection, and by doing so, he gives us the only recovery that we have out of sinful nature and into a right friendship with God. It was his joy to do it, but there was a great deal of pain in getting there. And we're going to look at that, the climax, I believe, really, of that pain this morning as we look at Luke chapter 22 as well as John chapter 18 and travel with Jesus as he takes us up to the Mount of Olives and to the Garden of Gethsemane immediately after he and his disciples celebrated the Passover meal, which Jesus used two of those elements, the wine and the bread, to indicate his new covenant in his body, bread, and in his blood, represented in the wine. So as they're traveling up, and we read in Luke, it seems to be that Jesus frequented this Garden of Gethsemane. It seemed to be a lovely and very serene place where he made, give me some latitude here, where he made connection, strong connection with the Father. Now, weren't they one? Well, yes. Which is why I don't want to say which is why he prayed to the Father. It's much more than that. This is God captured in a body, stretching out toward the God that he used to be or was and left behind. And he does that in a spiritual conversation, but it's more than that. It's a reunity. It's a connection that they have not had to experience since from the beginning. They have always been together, but they are separated by flesh and blood at this point. And Luke records this in chapter 22, verses 39. He says, then accompanied by the disciples, Jesus left the upstairs room and went as usual. So again, it's customary to go to the Mount of Olives. There he told them, pray that you will not give in to temptation. Now, this is a critical word and a good study for us to understand. It is the Greek word parasmos, and it can be translated in a number of different ways. Most often, we find that Greek is a much better, much more definitive language than even the English language that we're using. For example, in Greek, there are, at least 3 different words for sin, and there are 4 different words for sin, and there are also 4 different words for love, just different kinds of love. But here we have one word that can be translated, parasmos, can be translated as a test, as a trial, as a temptation. It really, the word really means experiment. So I want you to go back to your high school science course and stand at the Bunsen burner at that counter and think about an experiment and what you're doing with an experiment. An experiment is offered to prove something, to test a theory, and to prove whether that theory is accurate, truthful, secure, or whether it's not. And this is the sense of the word parasmos. When a Greek word can be translated in a number of different ways, then we understand that the context, the situation, the scenario is going to be the key to understanding how we should translate the word each and every time. Whether we're going to translate it as test that proves a good outcome, or whether we're going to translate it as a temptation that proves a failed outcome, is found in the context of the use of the word. So in the context, when the word parasmos is used in the context of faith, it means that the faith is being tested to prove its worthiness, its sturdiness, its security. It's glory. But when the context is about a temptation, then we know that what is going to happen is that this particular application of parasmos is going to end in failure. It's not going to succeed. Now, before we go any further, let me just remind you of what James says in chapter 1. He says in his letter, he says, "Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you face various parasmos, various trials." That's kind of the word that's used between test and temptation, trial. Consider it all joy when you face various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance, and let endurance have its perfect course, that you may be perfect, lacking in nothing, knowing that God can never be tempted and never tempts anyone. Rather, God tests so that he may prove his faith in us is perfect, strong, valuable, worthwhile. Okay, so here's what we just discovered. James reminded us that God never tempts anyone, and he himself cannot be tempted. So if when you're looking at a situation in your life in which you think your faith you may be wondering whether your faith is being tempted by God using the same circumstance, or whether your faith is being tested by God or tempted by Satan, for example, you'll know by the outcome. If you succeed, was it a test or a temptation? If you succeed, if you rely in your faith and find God to be worthy, was it God testing you or Satan tempting you? It was God testing you. He wanted to show you what you didn't know before this particular set of circumstances came up. And he allowed it. He used the circumstances to prove, to show to you the value of trusting him. He knew the outcome before it started. So he tested you so that you could know the outcome too. But if you find that you failed in the application of your faith in God, if you failed in the application to trust him and chose instead to rely on your own idea, your own decision, your own assessment, your own choice, then you know that you were being tempted. And that temptation failed in terms of the application of faith in the circumstance. Are we clear? Okay? So it's a meaty word. And I love it for us. It's going to come into play in quite a few of our discussions during this sermon. God allows the circumstances to test his faith in us so we experience success in trusting him. So we put on display for us and everybody else who's watching what it's like to trust God and put on display the faith that he has given us in him. But Satan tempts us to fail by living independently of God. And Satan's not the only one. Our friends sometimes tempt us to fail. Right? Sometimes we tempt ourselves to fail because we're thinking the flesh might be a better way. Okay. Just by way of illustration, as a grandpa and as a grandma, we are involved in trying to find ways to challenge the grandchildren to experience successful opportunities in their growing abilities and their talents and their interests and their knowledge. When we test them about their knowledge, it will be something that we either just talked about or just read about or just discovered, and the application of that knowledge. We need that. We can't come out of the clear blue. I'm thinking about things like this. With Laker down here, I saw a unicycle one time at a thrift store, and I thought, I ride a unicycle. Why wouldn't he want to ride a unicycle? We're peas in a pod. So I bought that unicycle and got it home. First thing he looked at it, he said, "Hey, that's cool." He got on it and found it wasn't easy. right? And I just thought, I'm gonna let that brew for a little while, because I know that kid. And I know that he likes a challenge for himself. And pretty soon, he was out there not just getting on it, but riding that unicycle. We do this a lot. With his younger brother, Oakley. I wondered about how gymnastics might go for him. So I developed a scheme by which he might be challenged to do a handstand against a wall. And when he's successful doing it, it's just a thrill. Caroline is into drawing, and so we draw sometimes together. Catherine, when we were at Great Wolf Lodge, wanted to go up on the obstacle course and said, would you please go with? Of course I will go with you, because I think that I can ensure that you will be successful as I go with you in these things. Charlotte, just to raise her above head, she's scared to death of heights. Just to do that and to get her used to that is, again, just kind of a test for her. I'm reminded by a comment I made to in the large group this morning that I have been trained. I have seen a test, a beautiful test of faith exhibited by my mom, who was, after 4 days in the hospital after a fall at home, was dead set on going home. Dead set on going home. But the recommendation was that she should go to a residential physical therapy unit. She was not prepared to do that, and I only wanted to have the conversation one time with her. And so I waited until what I had hoped was God's timing, and we had this conversation with my mom, who she could tell by the way I was looking at her, by the way I was talking to her, she could tell that something wasn't probably going to be according to the way she wanted. And this was a quintessential experience for her of that. And so when I told her that we were going to put her into another hospital that worked on physical therapy and that would increase her strength, while that is easy for you to hear, it was not for her. And then I watched as my mom's beautiful character came out. And she willed herself in submission by trusting others, what others said, including me probably, what others said would be worthwhile, would be necessary, would be the best for her. I tell you, I don't know about you, but my will and I are not buddies. We are at odds most of the time, most of the day. But in this experience, I see again what I really want. What I really want is just what God wants for me. And I see her submitting to man's best, which I believe will be God's best as well. Why am I having so much trouble bringing my will under his control when I know he does me no harm ever? He cannot consider that. He wants only the best for me. He wanted the best for me at the cost of his son, Jesus, who took on flesh and blood. And for Jesus, this particular night, this experience and experiment, if you will, at the Garden of Gethsemane was a battle to believe. It was a fight for faith in God and his plans. Now, you should be thinking with me, why would Jesus, as God, have to fight for faith to believe God's plan? Weren't they together when they decided this? Before the foundation of the world? And the answer is, of course, what? Resoundingly, yes, of course. But we are now to the point. We are now to the point where while Jesus has been ridiculed and mocked, and while that's emotionally distressing, that distress is going to take on physical ramifications. You and I know that he will be a bloody pulp, a piece of hamburger, trying to walk a mile up to the top of Golgotha. He will be an inhuman piece of meat walking up there. Do you think he knows too? Well, he does, and it's pressing in on him. The reality of 33 years on the face of this earth, what's going to cost him physically in terms of completing his mission, is now on him. And we're going to see him pray, we're going to see him prove, and we're going to see him protect. As we look at the scripture in Luke chapter 22, starting in verse 41, we find Jesus praying. Why is he praying? Because he knows God's will. As God himself, he knows. He's connected to it. But he has to fight for faith to accept it. Linda, thank you. Luke records this in chapter 22, verse 41. He walked away, Jesus walked away from the others about a stone's throw and knelt down and prayed, "Father, if you're willing, please take this cup of suffering away from me." You know what he's asking. I don't want to face this kind of cruel and remarkable, excruciating death. And yet, I want your will to be done, not mine, in this moment, under this kind of pressure. Then an angel from heaven, Luke says, appeared and strengthened him, and he prayed more fervently, and he was in such agony of spirit that his sweat fell to the ground like great drops of blood. Agony. Fervently. Jesus is in the throes, the final throes of this battle. And he, like us, must fight for faith in the God he knows, even though he is God himself. And we should be saying, how can we understand this? How does this come together? And it comes together quite simply. Why does Jesus have to fight for faith in the God that he knows and, in fact, the God that he is? This came with our new associate pastor this week. He brought this to the office. It was something that he saw another teacher at Landmark have, and when she retired, he had our good fortune and the relationship to say, "Would you mind if I kept this?" And she said, "Please, keep this." This is obviously a rendition of the crown of thorns, and it is a marvelous rendition of that. If you touch it anywhere, you will not imagine the strength of these thorns and the length of these thorns that were pressed into him and his skull. But for us today, what I'd like this to represent is the fact that we have to remember that Jesus, when he took on a body, also took on the brain of that body in Adam's fallen image. What I'm saying to you is that just as Adam's mind was chaotic and confused, twisted, and thorny, so Jesus had to fight against this very chaotic, Adamic mindset. His was tangled. His was impaired by sin. Though he never sinned, he took on a body that had sin in it. But he never gave way to it. I said to you, God is trapped in a body. Such a truth. Such a truth. This is the work of the Holy Spirit in us. After we're saved, after he indwells us, his work is to untangle this mess so that we might see God as he is, or more clearly as he is, and that we might trust him, which is the only reasonable thing when your mind doesn't look like this. In us, it is the Holy Spirit's job to untangle this mess. And he's doing it in each and every one of his vessels, in each and every one of his children. And we're demonstrating the proof of that, oftentimes with success, and sometimes in failure. Learning from both of these things. Jesus proves to be the perfect man by acting in faith at all cost, personal and otherwise. And Jesus models what God intended for every person in doing just that. That no matter what the circumstances that are pressing in on us, we have a God who has a better way, the best way. And as we trust him, we learn that the faith he's given us in him is worthy of that trust as he is. Jesus, as you know, Paul calls Jesus in Romans chapter 4 the second Adam, who has come to recover what Adam, the first Adam, lost in the Garden of Gethsemane, or the Garden of Eden. And so we have two gardens, if you don't mind me saying so. Adam lost the blessing of God's relationship in the Garden of Eden, but Jesus is reclaiming that blessing in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus did not suffer a condition that caused him to bleed sweat, to sweat drops of blood out of him. It is, what I mean by that is, he didn't have some predisposed condition or disease for this. It could happen to any one of us under this kind of agonizing stress. Jesus didn't suffer a condition, but he did suffer a medical phenomenon. It's called hemidrosis, hemi-blood, or androsis, the leaching out, or hematidrosis, or you might even hear this word, hematohidrosis. Hematohidrosis. We're going to go with the simple one, hemidrosis, a rare instance of hyperextension of the flight or fight response that triggers blood capillaries all over your body, the vessels in your body, under stress, under ridiculous stress, to burst and cause body to exit through your skin, through the sweat glands, and potentially through every potential pore of your skin. This could happen to anybody under the same circumstance as Jesus. That's what I want you to know. Now, did I just say that Jesus worried? Is that what we're talking about? Jesus was in such dilemma. He was so worried about what was coming. No, Jesus did not worry. Why? How can we know that? What do we see him doing? We see him fretting and sweating and wringing his hands and wondering what he's going to do about this. No, what do we see him doing? He's on his knees. Who's he talking to? All right. Now, therefore, you remember that in Philippians, we talked about be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God that comes through this interaction with him, not the worry, will be yours beyond your ability to explain it. Here's what I just said. Don't worry about anything, but rather in everything, pray. And that's what we see Jesus doing. Now, did Jesus endure stress? Absolutely. Stress is a fact of life. Worry doesn't need to be. But stress happens when we discover that our lives are going in one direction, and that one direction is against the culture of this world. And what brings that stress on us is the unfortunate imbalance of what we value, what we prioritize. We need to let God in that so that he can reset those things like he did for Granny. So he can tell her, no, if you go home, that's not the best plan. If you go here. And so she says, okay. Yeah, Jesus was under a great deal of stress. Knowing what would happen in the next 12 to 18 hours does not offset what is going to happen. In fact, it makes it worse, does it not? Pretty sure that's why God doesn't tell us when our last day is. You wouldn't live in between days. So we see Jesus praying to the Father, and we see his stress come not from the unknown, the worry or anxiety, but rather from the known. He anticipated the reality of the beatings, the canings, the floggings, the cattail 39 lashings, and the crucifixion that resulted in his death. He knew what lay ahead. Knowing this created the stress that produced in his body this hemadrosis, so much that his body could not contain the stress and began to bleed through his sweat pores, giving way to a rare physiological manifestation, hemadrosis, sweating blood. Luke says this, at last Jesus stood up and returned to his disciples, only to find them asleep, exhausted by grief. He said to them, why are you sleeping? He asked them, get up and pray so that you will not give in to the word temptation, translated here. Correctly, I believe. Why, if they weren't praying, would they not be ready for the temptation that came to them? Go immediately to Peter. He's already been told he's going to deny the Lord. Does he want to deny the Lord? No. Is it a failing application of his faith in God? Yes. Does it happen? Yes. It does. Is it fatal? No. It's not fatal. But it does happen. And it disqualifies Peter in his own mind until Jesus can get to him and kind of help him to renounce that he really does love the Lord. So, this plays out. I have to tell you this. I think it's beautiful. Pastor Jeremy showed it to me. The original Passover in Egypt included a night of watching by the Lord. Passover night, they didn't sleep. They didn't know when the Lord would lead them out on the first Passover. All they knew was they had to eat the meal dressed and ready to go with their sandals on and their staff in their hand, right? That's what we know about that. What they didn't know is when they were going to leave. So they watched. All night, they watched. It is a vigil for God's provision and protection in deliverance. So from that point on, because that was the original experience, that was the night of watching by the Lord, from that point on, the annual celebration of Passover included a vigil by the Jews, a night of watching and waiting to see the Lord's provision and protection of deliverance through Messiah. And here are these 11 disciples, fast asleep, who cannot keep the watch that was regulated for that night. Even though a stone's throw away, there is the Messiah, the one they have long awaited, who is going to do what is necessary, rather than to seek his own will. Jesus, the God-man, takes his watch, his vigil, a stone's throw away, as God bolsters him in the cost of his own mission and sacrifice. But the disciples were too weary. He doesn't blame them. He just wants better for them, and his way is better. If they would be in prayer, so that God could work in them to guard against their failure, their denouncements. The disciples were too weary, drained by grief, really, to vigilantly watch with him. They would have, had they seen Jesus, they would have seen the victory of faith. I love that. All right. So Jesus moves on to proving that not only did he know man's will for him in this regard, but he was fighting for faith to allow it, to allow sinful men to be used by God to bring about his death. Luke 22. But even as Jesus said this, a crowd approached, led by Judas, one of the 12 disciples. Judas walked over to Jesus to greet him with a kiss. But Jesus said, Judas, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss? What an oxymoronic action, right? Jesus fully realized all that was happening to him, and so he stepped forward to meet them. Who are you looking for? Jesus said. Jesus the Nazarene, they replied. I am, Jesus said. Judas, who would betray him, was standing with them. As Jesus said, I am, they all drew back and fell to the ground. Now, this I am pronouncement is meant to take us back to Exodus, chapter 3, and the burning bush, where God called Moses to lead his people out of their their slavery in Egypt for the first time, for the first rendition of deliverance. It's meant to take us right back there. It's meant to tie a very nice bow between the old and the new. And he's going to accomplish what that could never have accomplished, what that Exodus could never have accomplished. And you remember that when Moses said, who shall I tell your people? Isn't that interesting? He was among them. He knew it. Who shall I tell your people is sending me to lead them out? God says, tell them, I am that I am. That's what he called himself. Jesus knows the cost of his mission to recover mankind for God. He has won the final fight for faith, but now he is tested to trust God's plan as God uses sinful men to accomplish his will. Can God use sinners to do his will? Clearly, yes, he can and did, and maybe still does. Could there be anything more difficult for Jesus than yielding his life into the hands of sinful men? There's something very wrong about that. But it is not those who loved him, who knew who he was, who identified him as Messiah, who would ever put him to death. So it had to be by the hands of sinful men. In Hebrews, we read this in verse 12. Think of what Jesus went through. How he put up with so much hatred from sinners. So do not let yourselves become discouraged and give up. For in your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of, actually, the word is shedding blood or being killed. Jesus, God as man, unrecognized, rejected, and ridiculed by those he came to save, who were utterly unaware of their fate. John writes, so the Word became human and made his dwelling, his home among us. He was full of unfailing love, love that did not fail, and faithfulness. To those who believed and accepted him, Jesus gave the right to become children of God, reborn of a new birth of his Spirit. So, like Jesus, we've got to prove God's will first. That is, we've got to act like we believe it. Belief will take action in order to protect his plans for ourselves as well as for other people. In other words, we dare not try to protect other people from God or his will in our lives. You may be wondering, why do I think this happens? Actually, I say it happens all the time. How do we try to protect others from God's will? By forgetting who's really in control. by trying to regain or trying to gain control back for ourselves. We forget who really knows what's best, whose will is always perfect and acceptable. We're tempted to distrust and ignore God's will for our loved ones because we don't like it, or we think they won't like it, or it's too hard to accept, or we believe it will adversely affect them or us. I remember when your mom, Heather, our youngest daughter, came home from a week at summer camp, Christian summer camp, and we knew, we had been kept abreast, that she was wrestling with salvation. She had prayed at age 7. She had walked an aisle at age 7, but according to her, she was not sure. That's why I always will look at you and say, listen, it's up to you. You have to assess for yourself. If you don't have confidence that you are His, then don't stay there. Because you can't be infilled by the Spirit without inviting Him to do so. It's impossible. Nobody that winds up with God in heaven after judgment and recreation is going to be surprised they're there. But there will be a lot of people somewhere else that are absolutely shocked that they're there. Do you understand what I'm saying? So, on Thursday night, after a week, almost a week, 4 days of absolute wrestling, Heather, with herself, about this issue of control, she surrendered. She submitted. She gave up. And so when she got off the bus, she burst into joyful tears because the battle was over and she knew who won. And she wanted him to win. And he filled her life. And she gave testimony and then was again baptized because now she was saved. A baptism that demonstrated that salvation. She also had a girlfriend that went to the same camp with her and was probably walked somewhat through her own situation with her. And this girl got off the bus, also having made a profession of faith earlier in life, but wrestled herself to the point where she made the same profession of faith. She got off the bus changed, and she had pronounced to her parents, "I got saved." And her mother said, "No, you didn't. You were saved as a child." I wanted to take her out. Want what you want, Mom and Dad. Want what you want. But you cannot save anybody else. You cannot save your children. And to deny their experience without even giving it a hearing because of what that might make you look like, that's not okay. They are not yours first. They are God's first. And we need to help them get to Him, not depend on us for everything. We're going to let them down. We're imperfect. We need to get them to the perfect one, the one who knows how and what to do all the time for them. Lastly, we're looking at Jesus and His protecting. He knows your will. We're going to look at a situation that demonstrated His ability to protect His own. But you are among those now if you are born again. He knows your will, and He knows you're fighting for faith to live it. John chapter 18, verse 7. Once more, Jesus asks them, "Who are you looking for?" And again they reply, "Jesus the Nazarene." He said, "I told you, I am. And since I am the one that you want, let these others go." He did this to fulfill His own statement, "I did not lose a single one of those you have given me," addressed to the Father. There is no safer place for any of us to be than where Jesus is. So if you've taken a detour in your life, get back with Him. And this place is safe whether we are here or in the next life, as long as we are walking it with Jesus. So I have one question for you. How is God testing your faith to prove His reliability? How is God testing your faith, some of the circumstances, to prove his reliability in your life, to prove that he is the trustworthy one,